funeral is underway in Chicago, and Sam explains to his son Jonah that his mommy got sick and no one could do anything to save her. He is back at work the next day. A colleague comes up to him and hands over the card of a shrink he knows, but Sam turns around to pick up a bundle of cards he's got till now and throws them out. He finishes off mentioning that it's better to focus on work rather than losing himself grieving. His colleague is speechless, and Sam says not to mind him since he just lost his wife, so the colleague mentions he'd take a couple weeks off and be with Jonah. But Sam says that he needs a real change and goes somewhere they are not reminded about his wife Maggie. He thinks of an old memory and tells his colleague that he's thinking about moving to Seattle. Just like that, we move to 18 months later in Baltimore, where we come across Annie and Walter, who are visiting her family for Christmas Eve. While having dinner, Annie announces to her family that she and Walter are engaged. Everyone congratulates them, but Walter starts sneezing 'cause of the flowers on the table. Annie goes to take them away, but Walter stops her and feels embarrassed for ruining the moment since he is allergic to flowers and nuts. Moving on, Annie's aunt asks about their marriage plans, and before either of them responds, Annie's father, Cliff, suggests they get married in June in their garden. Walter says he's okay with the arrangement since he's the happiest man on the planet in that moment. Following this, Annie's uncle, Howard, calls for a toast and the dinner ends. Sometime later, Annie's mother, Barbara, presents her the wedding gown handed down in their family and feels happy for her. As Annie tries the wedding gown, Barbara mentions that the way she calls Walter feels too formal, but either way, Barbara wishes her a happy life ahead and goes on to hug her. But sadly, the gown rips. Annie takes it as a bad sign, but Barbara brushes it off. After this, we see Annie and Walter leaving the house, and she learns that he has had no nicknames ever. She tells Walter to go ahead, since she forgot her bag back at the house. After picking up her bag, Annie drives back to her place, and as she tunes in the radio, she hears a kid named Jonah calling the show hosted by Dr. Marcia. Marcia is surprised to have an 8-year-old call her show, and Jonah mentions that he called in for his dad who needs a new wife. To learn more about the story, Dr. Marcia asks Jonah to get his dad on the phone. Jonah agrees but mentions that if his dad gets angry on him, he's never listening to her show again. Annie comments that the host is crazy, and Jonah calls his dad saying he's got a call. Jonah reveals to Marcia that his dad's name is Sam as he comes in to pick up the telephone. Sam takes the call and is surprised that he is on air. He calls Jonah out to join him, but Marcia suggests that he talk about his wife since it's hard for Jonah to see him sleepless. Sam feels otherwise and declines to talk, but Marcia asks him to consider this as Jonah's Christmas wish. So, Sam stays on the line and joins Jonah on the bench to start describing about Maggie. Dr. Marcia mentions he might fall in love again someday, but for Sam it is hard to imagine. Marcia asks Jonah and Sam to stay on the line as they come back after a short break. Jonah reveals to Sam how other people will join in to comment on his story later in the show. At this time, Annie stops by a diner to get a drink as she hears the waitresses talking about getting their hands on Sam. So, she gets back on the road and the show gets a ton of calls from ladies willing to visit Sam. Declining to disclose his details, Marcia asks Sam what he loved about his wife, and Sam questions if the show runs long enough for him to finish. Either way, he goes to share his love for Maggie. Women all over the country, as well as Annie, get emotional hearing his feelings. After this, Dr. Marcia closes the show wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and dubs Sam as Sleepless in Seattle. Annie works at a publishing company, and she hears her colleagues mention communications all across Chicago was jammed due to the influx of calls to the radio show because of a boy who called the show saying his dad needs a new wife. Annie sits in to share her views since she ended up crying after hearing his story. The others ask Annie to cover this story, but she rejects their idea, and Becky, the editor, takes Annie to lunch to talk this over. Becky says she did not like Sam, but Annie says he sounded nice. Becky gives her the winky, but Annie points out how she is in love with Walter and tries to bring up something funny he did the other day. However, Annie doesn't seem to recollect what it actually was, and Becky looks annoyed by Annie's behavior. It is now New Year's Eve. Annie and Walter are at a party sharing their plans about visiting New York the next year, and Walter makes it sound like a business schedule, and Annie feels a lack of connection with him. At this time, Sam takes Jonah to bed as they wish each other a happy new year. After that, Sam lies down on the couch and thinks about Maggie still being there. He tells her it pains so much that he still misses her. The following day, he goes back to work to find his workmates waiting for him at the door. He turns back, but they grab him in, and Clarice, one of his clients, shares how she heard him on the radio and offers that she is available. Sam is not sure of what to think about it, and after this, we see Sam going home while it's raining cats and dogs. He finds Jonah receiving a ton of letters, and he tells Sam that they're all for him from women all over the country. Sam isn't happy knowing that Jonah gave their information to the radio show, and Jonah soon starts reading the letters one by one. But Sam asks him to stop, since that is not how he wants to do things. We go back to see Annie and Walter getting ready for bed, and we notice Walter's side full of medicines for his allergies and Annie preparing for his condition. She has trouble sleeping and decides to go down as she turns on the radio. There's a replay of the show Sam was on, and she gets emotional listening to his voice and starts crying. The next day, she visits her brother, Dennis, asking him how he decided to get married and what made him do it. He answers that it was either marriage or breakup and he decided to get married. Confused, she tells Dennis that she is fantasizing about some man in Seattle whom she hasn't even met, and she doesn't want to regret not having tried to see what might have happened if she contacted him. Talking herself into her plan, she goes out thanking Dennis. At this time, Sam is with his friend, discussing the current scenario of the dating market, and learns that he's pretty outdated. He reminds Sam about Victoria, who obviously likes him, and asks Sam to take her out on a date. After taking notes for the date, Sam goes home to find Jonah with his friend Jessica. The kid tells him to leave, and a speechless Sam backs off, still processing what just happened. Leaving them aside, he goes down and calls Victoria, asking her out for dinner on Friday night. She agrees, and Sam feels happy to having taken a step into dating again. Back to Annie, she is writing a letter to Sam and Jonah, and Becky, who is with her, quotes the scenario from the movie they're watching, and Annie adds it to the letter as well. But she crushes it up since it doesn't feel right for her to do so, and the two friends watch the rest of the movie and cry while saying they'll never know love like they show in the movies. Switching to Jonah, he is having a nightmare and calls for his mom. Sam comes to him and says he cannot sing to him like his mom to comfort him, and tells how much he loves him. After Jonah falls asleep, Sam goes out on the deck, and at the same time, Annie is sitting on a deck somewhere pondering over her feelings. In the morning, Annie uses her reporter network to get Sam's contact details and faxes a detective agency to look into his background. Just like that, it is now Friday night, and Sam gets ready for his date, and before leaving, he gives their mail over to Jonah. Jonah reads the letter and stops Sam from leaving. Jonah mentions that the letter is from a woman named Annie from Baltimore, and he really likes what she has written to them. But Sam points towards the map showing that they are on the opposite ends of the country and rejects his idea. Sam soon leaves for his date, and we see Victoria, who is excited to be on the date with Sam. But at this time, the waiter notifies Sam that he's got a phone call. Jonah is on the other end asking whether they visit New York for Valentine's Day, since Annie wants to meet them on the top of the Empire State Building on the day. Jonah says Jessica's parents are travel agents and can help with their plan, but Sam tells him to leave him alone and goes back to his date. As they enjoy the dinner, someone takes their pictures, and the next day, Victoria joins Sam and Jonah at their house, and Jonah doesn't like Victoria at all since she starts laughing for whatever Sam says. Sometime later, Jonah comes down to see his dad and Victoria kissing outside. He immediately crawls towards his phone and calls someone. On the other side, Annie wakes up punching Walter as the phone rings. Becky tells her to listen to the radio, and Annie goes down after telling Walter to get back to sleep. She turns on the radio to hear Jonah on the show asking Marcia for an idea to stop his dad from kissing Victoria. Marcia tells him to talk with his dad the next day, but Jonah cuts the call and screams. Annie screams as well since Walter found her listening to the radio inside the broom closet. Also, Sam confronts Jonah for scaring him and Victoria. He tells Jonah to go back to sleep, and at this time, Annie lies to Walter that Becky thought the guy on the radio was her husband Rick and asked her to listen to the show. That night, both Annie and Jonah have trouble sleeping. The next day, Jessica suggests Jonah write back to Annie, and Annie asks Becky that she would like to cover a story on the radio show. As Jessica and Jonah post their letter, Annie takes a flight to Seattle. In Seattle, Sam and Jonah are at the airport to see off Victoria, and Sam notices Annie exiting her flight and tries following her since she catches his eye but misses her in the crowd. Annie is out on the road and reaches their house, but finds that Sam and Jonah just took off on their boat. She follows them along the road, but she doesn't approach them and only watches them play on the beach from across the road. In the evening, Sam and Jonah return after playing, and Annie goes back to her hotel and calls Becky to tell her what she did during the day. The next day, Annie gathers courage and approaches Sam and Jonah, but finds a woman running towards them. It is Susie, Sam's sister, but Annie misunderstands the situation frustration seeing how close she is with the father and son. Annie spaces out on the road, and as the truck on the road starts honking, Sam notices her and recognizes her from the airport. He says hello, but Annie leaves and returns home on the next flight. She explains everything to Becky and feels stupid about what she did. Annie even shows Becky the pictures the detective she sent took and explains that it is the same lady she saw with them. As Becky claims that she is being idiotic, Annie finds a letter addressed to her from Seattle, and Becky reveals she sent the letter she wrote. Annie finds that it's from Jonah and learns that they are okay to meet her on Valentine's Day. In the next scene, Sam explains meeting the same woman at the airport and outside his house to Greg and Susie. Sam explains to them about what Jonah did with the radio show, and now he wants to meet this one woman who wrote to them about meeting on top of the Empire State Building on Valentine's Day. Susie thinks it's just like from the movie An Affair to Remember, and as she starts talking about the whole drama, she gets too emotional and starts crying. And after she's done, Sam and Greg start talking about a war movie that always tears them up. The following day, Jonah and Jessica watch the movie, and she starts tearing up as well, mentioning how romantic it is. Right then, her mother goes outside and asks them to keep an eye on things. Jessica uses this opportunity to book a ticket for Jonah to visit New York on Valentine's Day. On February 13th, back in Baltimore, Annie leaves to visit Walter in New York, and on meeting her, Walter says that he felt her distant since Christmas, but now it's like she is back to how she was before. Annie starts talking nonstop about various things and they go shopping. Sometime later, Walter gives Annie a ring and she accepts it, mentioning being the luckiest woman on earth. And in Seattle, Jonah is mad finding out Sam is leaving on a trip with Victoria for Valentine's Day. Sam hates how Jonah is acting out and locks Jonah inside his room. The next day, as Sam is getting ready to leave for his trip, he calls out Jonah but doesn't find him anywhere. He starts looking for him everywhere, and after a while we see him at Jessica's place, where her parents question her to reveal Jonah's whereabouts. She tells them that Jonah is now on his way to New York on a plane. She used her parents' computer to book the ticket. Sam immediately leaves to catch the next flight to New York. We see that Jonah has landed and is on a cab heading towards the Empire State Building. He wanders inside, and after he reaches the top, he asks every single woman there, is she Annie? And at the time, Annie and Walter are dining at a restaurant across the Empire State Building. Surprisingly, having to looking at the building and remembering the letters, Annie makes up her mind and reveals to Walter about everything. After she is done, Walter realizes that this is the end of their relationship and tells Annie that he doesn't want to be someone she settles for. Annie gives him back the ring and leaves the place. At this time, Sam reaches New York and storms out of the airport towards the location and stops only when he finds Jonah waiting alone at the observation deck, who apologizes for leaving home. Sam points out how Annie isn't there, and right then we see that the traffic has held Annie back and she gets down to start running to reach the building. She reaches the place after hours and is not allowed inside, but after she explains her situation just like in the movie, the guard lets her go take a look since the movie is his wife's favorite as well. But before she reaches, Sam and Jonah get in the elevator going down, and the coincidence is so crazy that Annie comes out as their elevator closes and she finds the place empty. The guard lets her takes a minute to look around and she finds a bag lying there. She picks it up to find a teddy bear inside, and right then, Sam and Jonah come back to get it. They all meet finally, and Sam recognizes her from before, and Jonah breaks the silence asking if she's Annie. Sam is shocked to learn that she is the Annie his son was talking about, and on seeing her hesitate, Sam asks her to join them. They feel the spark between them, and Jonah is happy that his dad finally met Annie as they all leave together. Well, that is it. What happened after that is up to our imagination, and let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I shall meet you in another story like this. Until then, this is your host from Movie Recap signing off.